All right. Welcome to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office podcast, Status Check. I'm Sheriff Nate Sickler. And today we have a couple of guests, Judge Kelly Ravassipour, and a returning guest, Community Justice Director Kiki Parker-Rose. So thanks for being here.
Good morning.
Thanks for having us.
So this is part 3 of our three-part series talking about our criminal justice system and some of the things that impact it with regards to corrections, because as a sheriff, we're responsible for providing jail services, correction services for the whole county. And we've known for a long time that the jail isn't ideal when it comes to helping other parts of the criminal justice system function adequately. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about that and just about your roles within the community or the criminal justice system and how that impacts livability in our community. So Judge, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how long you've been in criminal justice work and how long you've lived in the Valley.
Okay, so just generally speaking, I was raised in Medford, Oregon. I was a Panther, went to South Medford, graduated, went away for law school, and was gone for a period of years. Came back, was a public defender for roughly 10 years, and then was appointed to the bench by the governor, and have been a criminal judge for 13 years. In that time, I've had a few different roles. I did juvenile, I do some civil, like family law cases, but primarily, and right now, I'm the chief criminal judge for Jackson County.
Great. So just so everyone knows, the circuit court judge oversees most all criminal cases within the county.
Correct.
So any agency that submits a case to the district attorney's office, and if they file on that case, it then goes to your or the circuit court and potentially your courtroom for adjudication.
That's correct.
Yeah. And then Kiki?
So I'm Kiki Parker-Rose. I'm the Community Justice Director. And I have been involved in public safety in one way or another. This is going to be going on my 34th year. And so we oversee the Community Justice Department, which includes adult services, so adult parole and probation. We have the juvenile department, so probation, intake, diversion, detention, and treatment. And then we oversee the transition center program, which includes folks coming out of jail sometimes and finishing their sanction or sentence if that's an opportunity. But the majority of what we serve at the transition center is providing beds for our unhoused population, so that population that has difficulty living somewhere else, they live with us at the transition center. We have a couple of residential programs on site. Our work crews are dispatched from there. And then, as I said, adult services is adult parole and probation. And we also have a DUI monitoring ADIS services, and our community service work and home detention are also ran out of adult services.
Awesome. And so when somebody is, say, convicted by a jury or a judge on a bench trial, you sentence them and they go under the authority of community justice. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yes.
So
us or the instant prison.
Is what?
Us or prison, depending on the sentence. But
Yeah,
yes.
and they would need to be on supervised probation. So generally speaking, all misdemeanors are bench probation. Conditions of a bench probation are remain a law-abiding citizen and comply with specific contacts that the court can put in order, but that wouldn't be modified or monitored, I should say, by the probation department, unless DUI would kind of be the exception where we see show causes filed. If it's a felony case, then they go on to supervised probation, and community justice takes over from there.
Right, and we do have the opportunity through the state. They do provide us with funding for some domestic violence and sex offense misdemeanors. And then, of course, the new DEM cases, drug enforced misdemeanor cases, also come to us.
Yeah. So we have a pretty busy criminal justice system here, and we'll get into that a little bit more. I kind of want to talk about what you've seen over time. So you've went to high school in Medford, and you worked in defense for 10 years and then been a judge for 13. So you've seen a lot of changes, I assume, in the Rogue Valley.
Changes.
You know, I moved here in 95, so I've seen a lot as well.
Yeah.
Talk about that with regards to our criminal justice system from your perspective, if you can.
It's a layered answer, because I think initially, I would say 20 or so years ago, the population it's changed dramatically.
Yeah.
So 20 years ago, when we were dealing with the population in the jail, and most of my clients were in custody as
Sure.
a public defender, we rarely had to do mental health evaluations. And that was rare, where someone would come on screen, and as you know, they were identified by the color that they would wear for arraignments, kind of as a cue, like you knew if they were in solitary or if they were at risk.
Sure.
And that was rare. Like you would see maybe a couple a week. And fast forward to today, when we do arraignments, it's the norm. And so the mental health aspect is huge. And I think people have a general awareness of that. That's one thing that I think has just changed significantly in the last, when ballot measure 110 passed and we decriminalized drugs, I don't think people really understood the ramifications that would have on our state and our community.
Yeah.
And I can only speak, and I should say this up front, this is just my personal observations.
Sure.
And what I've seen, I don't have an agenda here, but I just know what I see the day in and day out. And the issues that I've had to face. So we've had a lot of different parties moving into the area with drugs. The homeless, houseless population has dramatically increased after the fires.
Sure.
And so I think our community as a whole just kind of had this implosion.
Yeah.
And then you're just trying to triage it. That's the second layer would be, the drug piece. And now we're trying to kind of, I say, put the genie back in the bottle with the DEM. And
the drug
and
enforcement
recriminalize.
misdemeanor. Yeah.
Correct. But there's really no teeth in that law.
Yeah.
So as a judge, I can't, there's a lot of things I can't do when it's an unclassified misdemeanor, but it's having some success. We saw some numbers yesterday with some engagement. I mean, the goal is to get people engaged.
Sure. With treatment.
And I did our treatment courts for years, and I'm a huge believer in giving access to treatment. And something I know that the jail has done is bring in MAT.
Yeah.
And they're trying to do that, and we're having success with that. The other thing that's occurred in the last few years, especially this year, is we don't have defense attorneys.
Yeah. That's a big problem.
And people don't understand that people that we're releasing on a regular basis are not people who should be released into our community. So you've got individuals, and again, they're presumed innocent, and they absolutely have a right to counsel. Traditionally, if someone told me when I was a defense attorney, there's going to come a time where we don't have attorneys, I never would have believed it.
Sure.
Because it's a fundamental right.
Yeah.
And seeing what the state is going through, I mean, I'm actively recruiting attorneys from around the state to come take cases here. That is well beyond what a judge normally does. I'm cold calling firms saying, hey,
can you help? Yeah.
Can you help us? And they've been gracious. The kindness and generosity of attorneys from around the state helping Jackson County is really awesome. And they've stepped up. And then lastly, when I was first on the bench, I started in a criminal role. When I made a decision to set bail or I made a decision to sentence someone, I didn't have to, in the back of my mind, do the calculation, who's going to get released when I impose the sentence? Who should be held? And that is something that we all have to think about. So we had 48, pretrial release is another Senate bill that came through. And, so there are different issues that we're dealing with, but the way that I can articulate it, I think, to the community, and I apologize if I offend anyone with this, but the reality is when I'm doing arraignments and I have someone who comes in on a felony DUI and the chance of them driving drunk is great, again, and killing someone is a reality.
Sure.
And I have to say, okay, should I hold this person, or I've got a sex abuse of a small child, and who should be released? Where's the greatest harm? And I don't think a judge, ideally, they should both be held, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is we don't have the space. And so judges are having to make really significant decisions. And then we have a very, pretty vigorous pretrial release system that we're having. It's good. We're communicating, people are complying, they're checking in. But it's early. We just took it over within the last year from community justice. So, that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I think mental health, drugs, shortage of attorneys, and no space for people to serve a sentence or be held pending a serious case are the main issues that I've seen change.
And I think just for perspective for the audience that's listening is, it was maybe 15 months ago. I can't remember when this lawsuit started about the attorneys. But basically, long story short, if somebody is in custody and they don't have an attorney within 7 days, they have to be released from
Correct.
custody.
And that's a federal order that
Yeah,
we're
it's
having to
federal.
comply.
And I was one of the sheriffs, unfortunately, that was sued and named in that lawsuit. It was a
Yeah.
sheriff from Washington County at
Correct.
the time, and then myself. And so the attorneys, I thought, were clever because, they're not going after the judges or the DA or the defense bar. They're going after the sheriffs who hold basically the keys to the jail door. So, and we've done really good, I think, in our county of partnerships and ensuring that, some of the higher risk clients get attorneys and can be held if necessary, for serious crimes. But you're right. Like, I think the public doesn't understand when people are in custody and they don't have attorneys that you, as a judge, and I, as a sheriff, don't really have a option to hold them in jail. And then there's a lot of factors that go into your job too with sentencing. I think I see a lot of, like, say, Facebook posts on when the
You
judges
just
aren't.
aged yourself with Facebook. Just so you
Oh,
know.
hey, we do that a lot here. So, but like people comment about, if the DA would prosecute or if the judges would sentence or this or that. But I think people don't understand how the system kind of works, and that you have guidelines with your sentencing.
I was just going to, can I just interrupt
Yeah.
really quick? Because I think the sentencing piece, a lot of people don't understand.
Yeah.
And so when I bring tours to the courthouse quite a bit, the sentencing guideline is something that a judge has to follow. So it's got the alphabet A to, I. You don't want to be an A. It's like the one time in your life because it means
Yeah.
you're a serious,
right.
offender. And then it has a crime category. And so we're required to use this grid block, and we have to follow it.
Yeah.
We can't go above it or below it. On a misdemeanor, I can't go above a year, in certain felonies. So some sentences seem very lenient to a lot of people. And it goes the other side too. With Measure 11 mandatory sentences, we have to follow those. And so, our hands are tied with that as far as the sentencing. And I think a lot of times people they think the sentences are arbitrary, but the DA, the defense attorneys, and the courts are all controlled by the grid.
Sure. So you sentence them, and then they come to you.
Then they come to community justice.
Yeah. And so you talked a little bit about your office or your organization. How are things going for you, and how is business?
Business is booming. And unfortunately, I say it that way, but we are actually seeing a fairly large increase in our intakes. When COVID hit and when there was the drug reform, we saw a large, drastic decrease in the number of cases we supervised by about 1,100.
Yeah.
And so now we're starting to see that spike. For example, for the DEM, the drug and enforced misdemeanor cases, I ran some numbers this morning just to be able to provide some information. So that went into effect September 1st. We've already had 132 intakes from that. And 63 of those are only PCS cases, meaning they don't come to us with an accompanying case, or they're not already on supervision to us. So those are new intakes.
So within 4 months or so.
We're starting to see an increase. We're also feeling the impact of not having defense attorneys because our probation violations are also being set out. We have some that are 6, 8, maybe 10 months out. And generally, we don't request a case to go back to court unless we're asking for revocation, because we can impose sanctions internally and address a lot of the criminal behavior. But when we're to a point we're asking the person to go back to court, it's because we're asking for revocation, and the majority of those revocations are revocations to go to prison.
Yeah.
And so that has really impacted us as well, because now we're continuing to have somebody on our caseload that's violated and continues to violate. So we put them in custody, and if there's not a means to hold them in custody, they get out of custody and they're still not complying. And so we have this circle of continuing to put them in custody, and they get out of custody pending moving forward with that violation. And so that's caused some, difficulty, and especially we are concerned about public safety at that point. We don't take lightly placing somebody in custody. We have a lot of other things we can do to address behavior, but when we make the decision to take somebody's freedom and put them in custody, the expectation is they stay in custody long enough for us to have a resolution. And that resolution doesn't always have to be going to court. It could be another resolution that we're looking for, but that has become a challenge for us.
So when you say somebody is violating to the point where you want to revoke and potentially send them to prison, what does that mean, a violation? Can you clarify that for the...
Sure. The violation could be a number of things. Generally, it could be a victim safety issue, whether on a domestic violence case or a sex offense case, or it could be somebody that's continuing to engage in maybe small criminal activity that wouldn't necessarily get them to prison, but for the probation violation, so they're shoplifting 10, 20, 30 times in the community, and they're getting a little bit of a hammer, but there's not a large hammer. It could be somebody that just continuously refuses to report to us, and so they go to jail, they get out, we don't know where they're at, we get a warrant, which takes the whole system to get a warrant, and we're continually processing, trying to get those folks in custody long enough to get an attorney, and two, to go to court.
So when you say they go to jail and get out, is that due to lack of space, generally speaking, or lack of attorney, a combination thereof? In your experience, what is...
I think most recently the attorney piece has been significant, but we do have a challenge with trying to keep somebody in custody for the time that we've requested they stay in custody because of lack of space. That's a challenge for us.
I don't have the statistic, and actually I'm going to look into this because I got the numbers for 2024 on the FTA status. So 30% of our cases, FTA is failure to appear. It means someone committed a criminal offense, was charged, and they just don't come to court.
Yeah, so when you say 30% of like all your court cases that
all
you
the
have
felonies,
assigned.
of the 5,411 cases, 1,647 were FTA on the first appearance. A couple of years ago, I think our FTA rates were even higher.
Yeah, they were. Yeah.
And like I tell people, I'm like, you want to see, come to court. And I invite anyone listening, I always just tell people, just come sit through morning arraignments. No one shows up, because people know that there's not a consequence for not showing up.
I was just going to ask, so why do you think people don't show up for
Because they know
court?
there's no consequence.
And when you say consequence, like if, as a judge, if you had, well, you have a lot of authority, but like if you had endless resources, what would happen if somebody failed to appear, say, on their first arraignment? What would be the ideal course of action?
I mean, normally they would go in custody, and then they would get put on a pretrial system, and then they would know that there's a consequence if you don't comply with a court order.
Yeah.
But, you know, and I will say a lot of the people that are coming into the system, they might have had a bad day. Not everyone's a criminal in the criminal justice system by any means.
And you say long-term criminal.
Yeah,
or
long-term
offender,
people
or
who, like, you know.
Some people make mistakes.
People make mistakes. And then I think about those people who are waiting for counsel, right?
Yeah.
They just want their police reports. And we have people over 500 on our list, I think is our most recent, roughly.
For unrepresented?
For unrepresented.
Oh, yeah, I think it's actually like 900.
It's huge.
Yeah,
like, I don't want to overstate it. It's significant.
Yeah.
And I think about the individual who has no criminal history, who knows what happened that day, got arrested, and now they've been waiting over a year to talk to someone about it. And meanwhile, they have some conditions put on them. But the FTA rate is significant, and the cost to the community,
it's substantial.
It's astronomical, and it's a lot. We have people in our building in the courthouse that their sole job is like clearing warrants, setting warrants, and dealing with people who just simply are not going to come to court.
Yeah, and we have staff dedicated to those tasks as well, and there's requirements, time constraints of how soon warrants need to be entered into the system once they come over from the courts. And and years ago we had to add people to those tasks because we were unable to keep up with the workloads. And same with Medford PD. So over time, I mean, we have this attorney problem, but that's substantial. I mean, I think Patrick Green, our district attorney now, who was, I think he was saying 1,100, 1,200 charges, and then 900 potential individuals who don't have representation who are floating around in our criminal justice system. What's kind of led to that? I mean, I have my ideas, but what do you think has contributed to this, I guess, compounding issue with attorneys and cases and high-risk offenders, which we'll talk about, but like, where does that come from?
I don't blame the current situation on lack of attorneys. I think that's a separate issue. I think the sentencing issue and the increase in crime is a lot of it related to drugs.
Yeah.
And people think it's not a big deal to, like, let's say someone uses, I'm just going to say meth, right?
Well, it's our
And
most commonly used.
It's our most
Oregon,
common
right?
in our DEM coming in, and they think, oh, it's now it's an unclassified. It started as a felony. I mean, people used to have a significant sentence when I started. Now it's really nothing. That's fine. Well, what happens when someone becomes addicted to drugs? They start committing crimes. They
Yeah.
start committing property crimes,
Yep.
right? Because they get to a point where they need their drugs, and so they're stealing to fund their habit, or they're dealing to support their habit, and those are more serious cases. So I think that while some cases may have lowered coming in, I think I think we're seeing property crimes increase.
Yeah, I mean,
I
it's
don't know
all.
if that answered the question.
Well, I think, for me, if we take, over time, when you look at the criminal justice system here, and it's always been kind of taxed. Like, I mean, we've always, I think, tried to make do more with less is kind of the mantra in our county. And not because we're not well supported. That's not what that is. It's just when you look at how the workloads and how they flow here, and you look at, I mean, I know there was at one point a study done by, I think, the state, and they said that you needed more judges here in Jackson County. And that was, I can't remember the number, but it was substantial, right?
Yeah, and we did get one. This
Get
year,
one, but
which
how
is
many-
great. They wanted like 6.
They wanted 6.
Something like
the
that.
workload showed that you needed 6 judges
Yeah.
to do the
What we
work
do.
that was required here, right? And I look at now the defense problem, but the police officers are very busy here. The district attorney's office is very busy. Patrick's office now and Beth's office previously, they file an extraordinary amount of cases into the circuit court compared to the amount of attorneys they have. So they have offices across the state that have 3 times the amount of attorneys and do about the same amount of work. So that's what I would say. That's red line. I mean, that's like a small engine trying to do a big job, right? And community justice, I mean, I'm not as familiar with your numbers, but I think you're also very busy per capita. Is that accurate?
We are, and it's, all of our stuff is based on risk. Like, what is the risk of the person coming through our door? So we do validated risk assessments. We do an initial assessment. And that initial assessment then determines, do we supervise this person at a field caseload where they have a parole and probation officer that they're checking in with often, or are they a lower risk person where we kind of say, here's what you need to do, and then we push them into what we call a reduced supervision unit and don't pay a lot of attention to that. Jackson County has historically had a high initial risk level and then an even higher supervision level, which comes from the secondary assessment that we do. We have 107 less high-risk offenders than Multnomah County. Multnomah County is not a comparable for us.
Yeah.
And so we have, we have the most high-risk adults on supervision than any other community in the state.
So number 2 in all 36 counties in Oregon, we're the second highest of high-risk offenders.
Yes.
So what does it mean when you designate somebody high risk? What does that actually mean? Or say, why don't you go through like low risk or medium? What are your categories?
So high risk means they have a high risk to recidivate. So if we don't do some sort of interventions, we're going to see recidivism continue to increase with that individual.
So they're going to commit more crime.
Their risk to engage not just in criminal behavior, but maybe some violent behavior and other things increases as that risk level is increased. We're required through the state to have a certain number of contacts with that high risk adult on supervision. And if you're a high level risk, you have to have a minimum of 3 contacts in person per month. Our next category is medium, where they're not as high as risk, but there's still a large risk to recidivate, and the same thing occurs. Then we're required to have 2 in-person contacts, and then low only as we need to have contacts with that risk level. The issue that we have is that our parole and probation officers right now are carrying caseloads of 60, and that's 60 high-risk folks. Right? We're not manipulating the data, which you can do. There's ways around that. Jackson County goes solely based on what our risk assessment says, and then if our secondary assessment supports that, we continue with that risk level. There's no way that one parole and probation officer with 60 cases can make 3 in-person contacts a month. That's 180 contacts per month with somebody under supervision.
Yeah.
We should, ideally, we should be able to make 120 because we're not just supervising people.
Sure.
We're going to court. We're engaged in training. We're involved in different committees. We have a lot of other responsibilities that our officers have, and so it's just really impossible for us. So right now what happens is we have these high-risk caseloads. We're trying to deal with those folks that are creating the biggest issue in our community, and we'll do everything we can to find alternative means to impose a consequence because incarceration is a big deal.
Sure.
But and we'll impose the minimal consequence necessary to impact behavior change. A lot of what we're doing is utilizing jail at this point because we have folks that are
high risk.
to commit.
To me, when you say that, again, you can jump in and interject. But to me, that means there's a potential threat or livability issues in the community with this individual if they're not complying with the terms of their probation.
Right, and that's what it is. Like they have a higher risk to commit new crimes.
Yeah.
So more victims, whether they're property crime victims, person-to-person victims, we have the propensity to increase the victimization within our community. If our officers were able to make contact, have 40 cases, for example, on their caseload, then we can do the work that we know that is impactful. We
Sure.
can engage in motivational interviewing. We can work with setting goals. We can do cognitive behavioral treatment interventions. We can provide services to disrupt that criminality. At the same time, referring them to appropriate agencies to get additional services like substance use disorder or mental health services.
Sure.
And so, our greatest challenge is, one, our numbers are high, and then the numbers that we do have, we're needing to impose a consequence for that.
Yeah.
And many times when we make the decision to impose a consequence, it's because they're a public safety risk, either to the community as a whole or to specific victims or individuals. And being able to place them in custody long enough maybe to get a victim safe, or 2, to create an intervention that we can then begin to provide service in the jail, which we now have that available, is more impactful for that person. Mm-hmm. So when they come out, we have a safer pathway out for them to move into, whether it's, our transition center program or maybe into some supported housing. But we are really challenged in that respect right now.
I'm glad that you bring up the part of, because we see them at the probation violations when they come into the court, is when we really have our interface with the probation department. And I just want to say, I am so proud of the POs in our community because they have a vested interest in seeing their probationees succeed. And, there's been such a pendulum swing since 20 years ago. The PO would walk in with the handcuffs, and it was this authority figure. Yeah. And now, when I sentence someone to probation, I tell them, I'm like, look, your PO wants to help you.
Yeah.
They want to see you succeed. They want to get you services, but you have to show up. Yeah. And so much of, so they need to have ideally 3 contacts, which would be great. But they're fielding calls from these individuals, and it's a large population that maybe has never had a positive interaction with someone of authority. And so that's a great responsibility. And I think your POs do a really good job.
Thank you.
Of making them know it's a safe place. But yeah, when we see them on a Friday, we know that a probation officer has done everything before they're brought to court.
Yeah.
And they'd be brought back to court sooner, I think, if we had other resources. Mm-hmm.
So how large is your office compared to, say, I look at Washington County with high-risk offenders, and I'm looking at a snapshot from 24, so I have no idea what it is right now. But, so we're still higher than them as far as high-risk offenders. How big is your office compared to their office?
Washington County is a comparable for us based on the population under supervision. Okay. So we are 5th in the state as far as the number of folks that we have under supervision.
No, I'm talking about how many employees do they have versus what you have? Yeah. Are they similar because of the caseloads, or do you have to do more with less in essence?
They're similar as far as caseload. We have funded 33 parole and probation officer positions. I think they're around 40-ish.
So a little higher.
They're a little bit higher.
Yeah.
They also run, they actually run a work release center in Washington County. In Jackson County, we run the transition center. So their total employees, I think we have on the adult side, so adult services and transition center, like 101. The department itself has 146 with juvenile services. And then I believe Washington County, we just talked about this yesterday on our numbers. I think they have about 167 total.
So they're kind of close. And it's really, you're funded based on workloads traditionally, or at least they try to fund you that way?
Yeah, and our funding comes from the state.
Yeah.
So we're a biennial budget, so we are at the mercy of the legislature to let us know what our funding is going to look like. Washington County's risk level, that initial PSC, public safety checklist, is not as high as ours.
Yeah.
But when I talked about, and maybe it's not manipulating, but you're able to conduct a secondary assessment where you might push some of those low folks up to a medium or high caseload. That level is a little bit higher in their county. I always say we don't really need to do that because we have the initial risk already. We don't need to mess with our numbers.
Why? I mean, what causes such a high-risk population in our community, do you think?
I think there's a number of factors, and Sheriff, you have had to defend this as long as I've been here, and since I've been here, we've had to defend it with the state and some of our resources because we do have a higher risk population, and it's hard for other parts of the state to understand what that risk is. I think some of the things we've looked at, failure to appear rates increase somebody's risk level. We also have a high number of drugs that are moved up and down the I-5 corridor. We have the large marijuana grows that were in our community. We have less housing available than maybe other places. I think that could be a contributing factor to the risk level. And we have a really good funded, really well-funded, police departments within our area as far as like MPD, Central Point, Ashland. And as we start to look at the population of folks that we're supervising, a lot of those are the result of active law enforcement in those communities.
Livability.
The livability team is tremendous. And so that doesn't mean that our law enforcement is overzealous. It means that we are fortunate because if we as community members make a phone call, we're going to get a response. Yeah. And that's the expectation of any of us in the community. So some that look at our numbers say, oh, you guys are, overzealous or something in your community. It's not. It's that we have a really good police department, a lot of very good police departments, including the sheriff's office. When you call, they're coming.
Yeah. And I think Kiki brings up one of the reasons you're asking is like, why do we have so many high risk? Yeah. When our FTA rate is so high, there's no intervention in interrupting that criminal behavior. So that's the bottom line. So if someone's on a drug spree or a crime spree, and there's no one intervening to stop that action, it's gonna continue. And
we say intervening. I think we can, for me, that's, like you said, we make arrests, all the police agencies, but they go to jail, and either we don't have space to hold them until they can get to their arraignment, or Senate Bill 48, or the lack of attorney, and you combine those things. But traditionally, over the years, it's been forced releases, because a forced release means, like that person got out of jail before they could have an assessment done by the courts, and get put on some sort of a pretrial program that's meaningful, or be held if they're a danger or a threat to the community based on their prior actions. And so these individuals come in and out of our jail, and then they go out and reoffend. And to me, it's pretty simple. They just keep racking up charges and crimes and fail to appear over and over. I mean, we've had some people, 80, 90 fail to appears. Yeah. And so, this inability to interrupt their criminal cycle, like you're saying, and hold them to give them a chance to settle down and get a chance to address their cases and their issues, whatever those could be, whether they're drugs or a mental health issue, or they're just not good people because they're criminals. But whatever the case may be, we don't get a hold of them until they cause enough of a problem to be held. Like, we have to have the FTA program, and you have to get to a certain mathematical point, you know, you have to be the top 50 in the county to be held, right? Like,
But I think if you look at the population of the inmates right now, people would be stunned
yeah,
at the people that we have in, and that pales in comparison to the people that we have out in the community.
sure. Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
people don't have an understanding that you can have committed a very serious Measure 11 person-to-person crime and just be out in the community.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, that's definitely significant. I think the other piece as you go further down the system is if we're not in a position for those folks to have that intervention early, they're going to end up going to prison, right? And that's because we didn't have the opportunity locally to provide those services that would be necessary to interrupt that criminal behavior. Now, it's not always going to be that way. People certainly deserve to go to prison,
Sure.
and they should go to prison.
Yeah.
But there is a large population that if we can intervene at the local level,
Yep.
then we can likely help make them more successful. We know our recidivism rate is higher with those people coming out of prison than for those folks that remain in our community and engage in services. And if somebody goes to prison, you know, they're getting 32% off of their sentences, and so they're not even serving all of their time in that capacity. That's a very expensive form.
and they're not getting services while they're in prison.
because they're not in
People
prison
need to-
long enough
Yeah.
to get the services.
And so the way that it works when we talk about programs in prison, just for the
Yeah.
two people listening to this,
Yeah.
is when someone goes to prison, you know, people talk about boot camp, which is fantastic, right? Or if you go up there and you're an addict, you can get into treatment, you would think, but that's
Yeah.
not the case. Your sentence has to be long enough to qualify for programs. If you take someone who's sentenced on our most serious offenses, like a Measure 11, which the mandatory minimum sentence they're going is 70 months. They do day for day, no programs. People, like our most violent offenders that we send to prison, get no treatment.
Mm.
So guess what? They're going to get released and come back. They're released to the community where the offense occurred, untreated. They've been housed with the most criminal people.
Yeah.
And so that early intervention as far as like changing pathways, and it just compounds.
So, like, in essence, it would be preferable to do things locally for lower risk offenders
Absolutely.
or less serious offenses. Address them early, get them involved with treatment programs and whatnot, versus waiting until they do something to the point where they have to go to prison.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they're high risk, we have the research shows we can intervene at local levels and make an impact. But we can't do that if we don't have appropriate consequences to put somebody in place to create that period of timeout, almost, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
During that time, it's not just we put you in jail and you stay there and we do nothing with you. We've created these incredible programs at the jail that can start to provide those services needed so that when we do begin to, again, I think I've said this before, but when we do begin to plan for their release, they have a lot of things in place before they leave.
Mm-hmm.
They
Yeah.
have connection to peer. They have supported housing. We provide telephone, so if they're engaged in, telehealth or any of those things, they have those same access to services as anyone else in the community would have. And so we reinstate their organ health plan. We do things that can help make them successful. We provide those supported services that they need.
Yeah.
And then when they come to community justice, and then we have the opportunity to begin dealing really with behavior change. But if we have somebody that's unhoused, addicted, and doesn't have any support in the community, it's kind of hard for us to start talking about their thinking when we don't even know, or they don't even know where they're going to sleep the next day.
Yeah.
And so
You can't hold on to them long enough to get them sober. So is that so we want to talk about like truth and sentencing or sanctions and that. So when you're up there and somebody has been convicted by a jury and you're the judge and you sentence them, how often does jail space play a role into your thought process, or when you give them a
Every
sense?
time I sentence someone.
Every time.
Every time. And I can't speak for the other criminal judges, but there is a calculation that goes on. And, I mean, we could get by up to a couple of years ago because the jail's always been, like, we all have a collaborative working relationship, like the POs, criminal justice, and the courts.
Yeah.
Because we all know what our resources are. So, like, right now, like you said, it's red line.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And it's like,
There's
you're
more
not going to,
factors than
I'm not
just-
going
yeah.
to risk community safety
Yeah. Sure.
because, like, to me, that's one of the most important things. but it is a factor that has to be taken into consideration. And after 20 plus years, you have a pretty good idea of who needs it more than others sometimes.
Yeah.
And you just have to be very intuitive and do a lot more in our role as a judge, I think, to give an appropriate sentence within the confines of what we can do with the grid.
Sure, you have the grid, yeah. So when you, like, say if you give somebody a sentence, are they likely to be able to complete that sentence in our current facility, or?
I don't think any of them do.
So
I mean, I don't know the statistic, but I assume when I sentence someone that they're going to maybe go get processed and released. I think under 30 days, right? I mean, it's going to be a quick. If it's higher and they go out to the work center, well, guess what they're going to do? They're going to run.
Yeah, and
They're going to leave.
Yeah, there was a few years ago that was really a significant problem. I mean, so the way it worked years ago, and again, it's changed a little bit with some of the things and the programs and things. But you know, they get sentenced by the judge, and then of course we were full, so then we would work community justice to take the offenders out to the transition center to serve their sentence, essentially. Because we in the past we've had 1 or 2 sentenced individuals in our jail at a time. Maybe it would fluctuate by a couple, but outside of sanctions, it was very rare that somebody was serving a long sentence in our jail. But yeah, so once they would go to community justice in the transition center, it's not a secure facility in the essence that there's, you know, guards and, you know, correction staff or whatever. And yeah, we had people, I think the record for somebody going on abscond status or fleeing is the back gate of the jail. So they got in the van to go to the transition center, and as soon as they got past the gate, they jumped out of the van and ran because they knew if they got caught again, they would just be released from jail and they'd start the process over. So, but yeah, we just don't have the room for sentenced individuals typically in our facility. And so what does that do for you? Because, you know, once you get them and then if they start violating terms of their probation, you know, you do have the ability to sanction, as you talked about, with jail time. How often is your sanctions being able to be honored in our facility?
A couple of things I would like to just kind of go back to what the judge said. We are making kind of the same decisions. Like if this person who is having contact with a DV victim needs to go to jail, and we have maybe somebody on supervision for a burglary that's continuing just to not show up, like which one who's going to get released on the back end, right?
Yeah.
Is it going to be our DV person having contact with the victim, or is it going to be our person that just continually doesn't show up? And so there is always that
And
balance.
then you're like, okay, they're not showing up? Are they committing offenses?
Right.
Are they using drugs?
Right.
You know, it's like, it just like you do this deep dive.
Right, and so you are always like, if we take this one, but that doesn't mean that we're not doing our job.
Sure.
It just means that we have to look at what the realities are as far as if we put this person in custody, who's going to be coming out the backside of that to make the room that we that we need. As far as like sentences and sanctions, we ran some data just as we were starting to talk about really funding and how much funding are we putting towards community service work as a sanction, home detention, jail as a sanction. And on average, in 2024, there were 1,712 total jail sanctions. The average sanction imposed was about 18.4 days. The adult on supervision spent an average of 9.7 days in custody. So that's 52% of the sanction that we had imposed.
Yeah.
Right. And as the jail days increased, if we had somebody that was going to serve 30 to 180 days, they spent 27.7 days, or 53.9% ordered. And so it's about half if you look at the overall population, regardless of whether we're putting them in custody for 7 days or 180 days, with some exceptions on those 180 days, because some of those are the Board of Parole and Post-Prison Supervision, and those can't be released during a revocation proceeding. So it's difficult, especially as a parole and probation officer, to plan. Like, I know that this person needs to be in custody long enough that we can get a victim safety plan in place. We can find appropriate housing for the person, because before they went into custody, they were continuing to live with the victim, some of those things. And we can't do that in 3, 5, 7 days, 9.7 days. We need the 30, the 45, the 60 in order to put those things in place to try to make sure that we're keeping victims and the community safe.
So does that impact what you do on the bench as far as in like the truth in sentencing, and then of course with your team not being able to honor the sanctions? Is that do people that are involved in the criminal justice system, they all know that, and is it like we see it on the patrol side as far as like this expectation that they can't be held in jail, almost like a entitlement.
I think it's common knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, has it ever happened in your courtroom or anything, like someone says, "Oh, you're not going to do anything about it anyway, so whatever."
All the time.
Really?
That's again why I say just come to court.
Yeah.
It's people think that we all have an agenda. Like, I don't have an agenda. Just come to court and see what I do every day. And the reality is people know there's no consequences, and the people who haven't been in the system and are terrified, they're terrified. They come into court and they're visibly shooken up because they're like, if I give them 10 days, like, they are terrified. I give someone else who's more frequent flyer, as we call them, and they just are like, I'll just take me in right now, because they know they're going to get booked and released.
Yeah.
But I think it's common knowledge, and defense attorneys too are telling their clients, like, well, this is the offer, and you're probably only going to do this much time.
Yeah.
And I think that comes into whether or not people are taking cases.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've heard it for years, going back to when I was working the road is, hey, how full is the jail and when am I getting out? Like, that's like one of the first questions. And then, as it's gotten worse and worse over the years, there's been instances in time where we've had, small opportunities where we weren't full, like right when we opened up after, say, COVID, right? And we opened up, hey, we're going to open up 60 more beds, or when we opened up the basement again, and I say the basement, but the beds, 60 beds, because we had to close them for a while. Anyways, like, people are shocked, and they're actually mad when they find out they had to stay in jail for a while. And the FTA thing, the FTA program, Patrick was telling us, and I've heard from Beth and other attorneys, that people avoid being on the FTA list as much as they can. Now, they're still the chronic offenders, but they know if they get to that top 50, they're going to be held, and that's not a desirable thing to be on for individuals. Now, the attorney issue, I think, has thrown a wrinkle into that as well, because even if we hold them and we can't get them an attorney, then we have to let them go anyway.
Can we ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do you think that your deputies in the field make a charging decision based on the fact that they currently know there's no jail space, there's no attorneys, and that the case most likely won't be heard for a few years? Like, does that ever come into play when they're...
I think subconsciously there is, and I think I don't know if it's necessarily with a charging decision as much as it could be with a cite and release versus an arrest.
Okay.
That's probably the most
So explain
common
for your listeners cite and release.
Yeah,
versus an
so,
arrest.
if we're in the field and it's not a mandatory arrest, so there's several charges that are mandatory arrests in Oregon where you have to take physical custody. And so if it's outside of those things, so like it's not a domestic violence, which is a mandatory arrest, officers have a lot of discretion. And I think in our county, we were talking with, I think Ivans and Patrick about it as well, was like, I want to say I heard around 60% of arrests were made by citation to appear, which is you give them a ticket and you tell them to show up for a court tape. Of course, then they FTA.
And then they don't come.
And then they don't come because they know.
And now if they do come, and especially if they're in custody, there's a chance of an attorney. Anyone out of custody doesn't get an attorney. And we have now hired someone at the courthouse who runs what we call we've changed the acronym so many times. I still call it the OPDC check-in docket, which is the Oregon Public Defense check-in. They get put on that. So they have no future court dates, and they have to call in once a month. And we can text them if we find an attorney. And they just stay on that list. For an indefinite period of time.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at a year and a half, like when this started. And they're just waiting to get a text from the court saying you have an attorney. And with crime going up, with people who are being lodged in the jail, right, they're taking those initial appointments.
Sure. Yeah, and we have, this year, I think we're about 1,500 to 1,800 lodgings more than last year, roughly, maybe somewhere in that term. So definitely a busier feel at our jail, and I think the system. And sometimes that can be a good thing. Obviously, if people are committing offenses and they're going to jail, that's a good thing. The DEM, the Drug Enforcement Misdemeanors, created some of that workload, but that needed to happen because it was, frankly, a free-for-all before the law changed with regards to open air use and some other problems that were created. So, sometimes when there's more lodgings, it tends to feel a little better in the community, but it's busier for all of us. So when the officers have time to make arrests and do things and follow up on cases, that can be.
But do you think that they would do more lodgings if they knew there was space for the people?
Oh,
that
yeah.
they were
So,
arresting?
yeah, going back, I mean, I
I
think
don't want
it's-
this to be about the indigent defense crisis, because that's a whole nother conversation. To
Yeah.
me, it's when we're making decisions, when you guys are filing probation violations and knowing when you can, when it's time to pull the trigger and say, okay, we're going to go to court and ask for a revocation or
Yeah, I mean, I
put
think
someone in jail.
there is I won't use the agency or any names. I heard this on the radio a couple years ago, and it was essentially a case where somebody who was under the influence had wandered into a house that wasn't theirs. Not to probably commit crime per se, but was like sleeping in their house. So a clear trespass, and somebody that's under the influence. And the officers responded from said agency, and they were dealing with it. And I think they ended up telling the homeowner, like, look, we can do two things: jail or detox. And here's the deal: the jail's full. Everyone knows the jail's full. The system's overtaxed, and it's like detox might be a better option.
Yeah.
And when I was on the road, that would be in lodging. I mean, you go into somebody's house and you violate their personal space. That's like
Berg one.
Yeah, and
Well, if
so
they had an intent to.
things have changed. At least you're getting a trespass warrant, right? Like
Easily.
and that's that would have been an easy trip before. But when you look at the totality of circumstances, I mean, we have to look at that as a sheriff's office, and we've always looked at it a little differently than, say, a city PD, because if you're in Prospect and you have a minor crime, it's like, am I going to drive, a total of 2 hours, back and forth to lodge somebody on something where the city of Medford might find it more appropriate because they're 5 minutes from the jail, right? So you always balance your resources and the use of resources.
Yeah.
But I think over the years, as a criminal justice system, the law enforcement has become much more, or is adapting much differently to our lack of space. And site to appear is used way more frequently in our community than I think others. In fact, and I haven't done any numbers, so that's anecdotal. But when we did country crossings years ago here, and we brought in law enforcement from other parts of the state to help us, and they said, hey, here's what we generally will take to jail, and here's what not. And they're like, what? You guys,
Yeah,
you guys
people
cite
are
and
always
release that?
surprised. Yeah.
You cite and release those things?
Yeah.
We have to. We don't have room. And they're like, oh my gosh, that's weird.
Maybe that's why our crime's so high, because people know that too.
Come to country.
Oh no.
Word travels, right? I'm going to live in a community where that's the case.
Yeah.
There's a mindset that some people
Yeah.
have.
Yeah, and it's I think our whole system, whether it's conscious decision or subconscious decision, especially we've had so much turnover in law enforcement, like at the patrol levels, and I think all the cities, at least from when I started, like I feel like the old guy now. Like I see all these young kids driving around.
You did reference Facebook.
Well, hey, that's like our main thing here, Facebook. Yeah, I know. Aaron
You might
over
have
there.
a broader audience.
Instagram,
like,
TikTok.
TikTok.
know.
I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
have those
I
accounts.
see
but
all that stuff.
I hear they're a thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Anyways, but yeah, no, I've been around long enough to have seen the things, and so I think maybe some newer officers who haven't worked for years and seen what it was like years ago, like Chief Ivins and I, when we were talking, is like when we take a DUI to jail back in the early 2000s or the late 90s.
Yeah.
Now we're really dating ourselves, right? Like
Yeah.
they would stay in jail until arraignment on Monday
Yeah.
or bail,
Yeah.
either or, right?
Yeah.
They could make bail.
Yeah.
But it wasn't uncommon for you to put somebody there Friday night, and then they would go see a judge Monday morning or afternoon or whenever the arraignment was,
Yep.
and then but put on a pretrial, and that was very common. And now, very rarely does I think DUIs end up in jail because of the room piece, and there's other options with detox and stuff, but it's just a different time. So I don't think we're taxing our jail nearly as much as could be if everybody was operating the same way we were, say, 15, 20 years ago.
And we thought it was bad then.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's all relative, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Things change. Sheriff, one thing I might be important for folks that are listening to understand too is when somebody comes out of prison, we're responsible for that as well. So in
Yeah.
Oregon, we're both parole and probation or post-prison supervision, where other states you have a probation office and then a parole division.
Yeah.
And I bring that up because there's also this notion, and I've met with even lots of folks here as far as law enforcement, where if somebody on post-prison supervision or the old parole violates the conditions of their supervision, there's this belief that we can send them back to prison. And folks were surprised that, what do you mean you can't send them back to prison?
Mm-hmm.
And we can't. And so that means that we deal with with violations locally on those folks that are under the state parole board. We can't send somebody back to prison unless they commit a new crime that sentences them to prison, right? And
So you need to use jail
we have to
for
use
sanctions.
local resources for that population that went to prison, served their time, and came out. And that means sometimes that those behavior levels and their risk levels are higher, and so we need the option to have additional jail space to impose the consequences that are necessary. We're required to sanction based on an administrative grid that the state has put together, and so we follow that the best we can, but we do have the option to override, and we do take advantage of that in certain situations where maybe in a different county they may think, oh, this is a small behavior level or violation, where here we know if we don't address that violation at this level, it's going to get to a level where we might have more victimization. And so we go ahead and do some of those overrides. And we do that as a preventative as opposed to being reactive to some of those
Sure.
violations.
Yeah. We talked a lot about the proactive versus reactive policing with the chief and when he was on the show here. And it's, there's some really significant benefits to being proactive versus reactive. And I'm sure, like you talked about with your contacts, minimum of 3 for your high risk a month or whatnot. But if you had extra time, maybe you could do 5 or maybe you could do 6. I mean, there's really not there's not necessarily, maybe there is where they say, oh, that's too much. But really, like, you're trying to give these individuals the accountability and the supervision they need to not reoffend or slip back into their criminality. And so when you're
Right, and the new contacts that came out, historically, local jurisdictions got to make a decision about how somebody is behaving in the community and how we're going to have contacts. We don't, how we're going to have those contacts. We don't have that now. The state's saying if you're going to get this state funding that we give you, it has to be in person, where before we could use things like we could call the treatment program, or we could go to court, or we could talk with their family, which honestly, the best home visit sometimes we can do is when the person's not home. Because then we get have the ability to have conversations with those that they live with, and find out what's really happening. Those things don't count, if you will, towards the requirements at the state level now. Those are just, that's nice that you do that, but you still need to have these 3 contacts. So that's a big change for us. 3 contacts in person doesn't sound like very much, but it is actually a lot, and it takes a lot of time to do that. And not everybody reports. Right, and not everybody's home, so it takes a lot of time. Yeah, they're not with us because they're law-abiding citizens and have a history of following the rules, right? And so it's significant. And so as we look at needing to meet those requirements, it's difficult for us to begin with, but now having those state imposed is also difficult. And we may sanction a little bit differently based on what those contacts are, what those contact requirements are.
Yeah, and you came from a different criminal justice system in Klamath.
Correct.
As did I.
So, yes, you did. We worked together.
So is there any glaring differences? I mean, do you see, because that was a busy county too. I mean, when I worked the patrol in Klamath, it was very busy. So I would say it was, back then it was busy kind of like it is here now for the city of Medford, because when I went over there, I think it was actually busier than Jackson County at the time, but now we've grown and things have changed and whatnot over time. But is it similar in other counties that you see, or have, like what we're dealing with jail space and high risk offender? I know we have the most significant problem, but
I think one of the differences specifically is then we saw lots of multi-generational criminality within that system. I think from what I'm hearing, we're starting to see more of that multi-generational criminality in Jackson County. And what that means is you might have grandpa, dad, daughter reporting and baby in DHS care, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we see, because there's not been any break in the ability for us to intervene in that criminality throughout multiple generations. We saw a lot of that in where I came from, but we also had challenges there, lack of jail space, it shut down to one pot. I mean, there was a variety of things. One of the things that I really appreciate with Jackson County is how incredible the relationships are.
Yeah.
The relationship really between all public safety systems, plus our partners, Health and Human Services, our peer organizations, our treatment organizations. Nothing is territorial. This is about, we're all here because we want what is better for our community. And you use the word livability of our community. And if we're working in silos, we're never going to be able to achieve what we all want, which is the health and safety.
Yeah.
And so that's probably one of the biggest things that I've really appreciated about this community from, our Board of County Commissioners and county admin throughout all of our systems. It's just been it's been incredible to see. I was just at Community Corrections Directors meeting the last 2 days, and you always hear about challenges that people have in other communities where maybe a community justice director doesn't talk to the sheriff's office, or they don't have a great relationship with the court or the DAs, or they don't have the ability to call their Health and Human Services director and say, we need your help, right? And I feel bad for those communities because they don't have the opportunity to enjoy the things that we do have in Jackson County. And I think because of that, we have challenges, we recognize the challenges, but we're all working to overcome the same challenges. We're not taking small bites at the apple and only dealing with what the court sees or what the sheriff sees or community justice. We're doing this all together.
No, I think it's really good. I think it's great for the community and the taxpayers and those that are investing into all of our, businesses, so to speak, the sheriff's office, community justice, everybody, because you're right. Without the partnerships and all the things, it would be way worse. Like, it would not be functional whatsoever. I don't
And that's
think,
a
with our
benefit, right, of a
challenges.
smaller county and community is that we are able to collaborate and work together.
Yeah, I think part of you touched on this earlier with people asking if the police are overzealous or heavy-handed with all of our numbers and all the things. But part of the dynamic, I think, in Jackson County that is unique to other places is we're big enough. I mean, we're the 6th most populated county in the state, but we are kind of isolated by a bunch of smaller areas, and so I think it's difficult for some of the criminal population or people that engage in activity that's undesirable for the community. They stand out a little bit more. There's not the anonymousness of a large city where, you can disappear. And then, a lot of counties, say up north, they all tie together and they're, you can barely tell where one begins and the other ends and all those things where we have these rural areas and breaks and kind of populated areas. And so you have a lot of police concentrated in an area with the people, so to speak. And so when somebody does something wrong, we're pretty active of trying to solve that issue. When somebody sees somebody, the officers know a lot of people. You probably see a lot of repeat offenders. You know them. And so when we see Fred walking down the street and we know Fred has warrants, it's not like it's not a big city feel. And so we catch a lot of people, and oftentimes they have new charges. So it's just easier, I think, to police in some regards. And then, of course, but we do have kind of big city problems too. So there's a lot going on with a lot of active law enforcement. And I think that also it lends itself to having these relationships you talk about, by being a lot of problems, close-knit groups, can't be anonymous. The sheriff can't run off and not engage, or the judges we all work together really well.
It really is significant for just to see the cooperation and collaboration. I mean, the public safety system is a complex system, and we all have our own roles and responsibilities. And if we only focus on our role and our responsibility, the community would be suffering from that.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to think what it would be like if we couldn't go to to the, to your group, the judges, and say, this would be helpful for our, basically making up for lack of jail space, like the FTA program, the fact that we have to have that, and some other things, Senate Bill 48, and being able to communicate and have you guys be responsive to the law enforcement needs and some of our other stuff. It's great.
Well, and I think it's good for the listeners to hear that everyone, it's a community. It isn't an agenda. It isn't, everyone's so afraid to speak their own truth in a certain way because things are so divisive. But like each department that we represent and that we're from is to have a livable community where people can feel safe.
Yeah.
And I think everyone wants that. Like that's like probably the common denominator, but like there are things that need to be in place in order to achieve that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think to sum it up, as we get ready to wrap this up today is, we all have our own pieces of the criminal justice system and everyone does their best. But I always come back and see it's like when I talk to the chief, I talk to the DA, talk to the judge, community justice, is the corrections piece is really causing us to do things differently, look at things differently, because we have to compensate for a lack of space.
A lot.
And it's costly. I mean, how many times have you seen somebody, start with a very minor criminal history where they're coming in and out and ends up being in prison and then under your supervision where they're high risk instead of being on for like a shoplift or a car cloud or a drug offense, and where you can, supervise them and intervene and we can direct them to treatment. And instead we're working with now parole and prison sentence. Has that happened quite a bit for you? Or is it?
I think all the time.
Yeah.
Well, and Sheriff, we ran that data when we were trying to get our Justice Reinvestment Program dollars, and we were being challenged from the state on trying to do that because of, one, the number of folks that we're sending to prison, right? And what that data told us was from the time that somebody went to jail on a property, drug, or driving crime until their case was adjudicated and they actually went to prison, they had 4 more lodgings before they were actually adjudicated, right? Well, that means those 4 lodgings are new crimes.
Yeah.
If we put somebody in custody, had the ability to hold them long enough to go to court and get through some of that process, maybe we wouldn't see that really high rate of prison use that we have for Jackson County.
Yeah, when you say that, so on average, we send more people to prison than maybe other places because of the significance of the offenses, which the state doesn't typically care for, and we actually have to justify why we're doing that. So it's not just, we don't want to deal with this person, we're sending them to prison, but we could send more.
Well, I think what you're saying about the person who I see initially on a low level, C felony or less, right? And then they keep coming. It is common practice for me, because I have a pretty good memory with faces and names. I'll be like, Joe, when are your other cases? So when they're at arraignment and we know them, we're like, let's get all your cases tracking. And we're just trying to consolidate and get everything so it's easy for them just to remember one court date rather than a preliminary, an arraignment, a show cause. But these people have so many cases. And I don't know why I'm smiling about it, because really you would hope they would come in and they had one case. Yeah. But the reality is they come in and we're like, okay, let's make this easy for you. You now have, 6 cases. Yeah. It's going to be on this day. This is your PO. Right.
That impacts, though, that does impact the defense attorneys because the way they are billed out, right? So if you have 6 cases, it's 6 times as taxing as 1 case, and therefore limits maybe that defense attorney to represent other clients. Would that be accurate?
Yeah.
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 So, I mean, it's
a credit. It's not a person, so they can only take so many credits.
Yeah, but if they're using 10 credits on one person because they've generated 20 cases, they're full. Yeah. So that then creates this backlog of work that we have sitting, which I refer to sometimes as a tsunami, because when it does finally hit our system, you're going to have supervision issues. We're going to have custody or being able to hold people in custody. You're going to have not enough judges to deal with it all. And the DA's office isn't going to have enough attorneys to prosecute them all. So it's going to be a mess. Yeah. Very costly.
Yeah. Yes.
So one last thing I kind of want to cover today is kind of the stick and the carrot. Now, you worked in treatment courts as a judge. Obviously, with community justice, there's a big part of the treatment and motivational interviewing and then accountability at the end. I think there's a belief out with some is that, we really need to invest in treatment and behavioral health versus the criminal justice system. And I'm not opposed to bolstering those. I think they're a need. But I think we need to have a system that works together. So you have to have the treatment piece available, but you also have to have the accountability because, frankly, the folks that we deal with in the criminal justice system probably aren't the ones that are just going to walk into a treatment location. Not saying it doesn't happen, but it's
Rare.
It's very rare. And so we need to have
And
that.
it's scary for people to take that step.
Yeah. And it's and many times they can't make that decision for themselves because of their
Correct.
addiction. So
Correct.
how do you see how are things changed, and does accountability or the ability for, using jail in some instances, does that change people's motivation to enter programs or treatment?
So just briefly, and I'm sure you'll have a podcast down the road on our specialty courts, but Recovery
I will now,
Opportunity
Judge.
Court
Yes.
is our treatment court that is solely for high-risk offenders. So individuals who have a prison sentence and have committed a certain number of property crimes, we put them in treatment court. I had the privilege to do it for a number of years. I would say it's probably the highlight of my career. I was involved in our initial drug court forever ago, 20 years ago. So it's something like I believe in change. I believe in people getting help. But it's a very complex system. And so when you're dealing with the criminality of a high-risk offender, and something Kiki touched on was the sanctions, it's a carrot and the stick was the analogy that we were trained on early on as treatment court judges, that you have to do quick intervention sentences to change that behavior. And you're probably well-versed and can describe that more. And that's very successful as far as treatment courts. I love it. I took a break from it. I went to one too many funerals from fentanyl ODs. And I just really cared about my participants.
Yeah.
And I think I just needed just a little bit of a break. But nothing makes me happier than when I see my participants still all over the community. Like you said, it's small. And you establish a relationship with them. And I think that helps. Those relationships formed in a treatment court, they're with peers and they're redeveloping friendships, and you have to have a new circle of friends.
Yeah.
You have to cut ties with your past if you want to move forward. And so a lot of the treatment courts enable people to get into an Oxford housing or do TCP. But before you get to that, graduation ceremony, there's a lot of speed bumps along the way. And I think that's where the probation can talk about how we get past those speed bumps to a point where it's internally motivated to get clean.
Yeah. No, and I 100% agree. That's the reason we got into this business, I think, is because we wanted what was best for the people that we provided our care and supervision to at all levels. Most people can make a change. They just don't have the ability to do it on their own.
Yeah.
The judge made a great comment about people are scared.
Yeah.
And they are scared. And we can provide that ability to reduce that fear for them as they begin to make that change in their life. The judge also talked about peers, they have to change their friends. We know peers are the number one criminogenic risk factor, meaning the factors that contribute to criminality for our population. Think about when your kids grew up, who they run around with, what was those impacts? And so we're dealing with the same things on the adult level. I think the carrot and stick analogy has been around a long time. A lot of times, probably in the last 10 years, it's sort of started to be frowned upon. But there's a tremendous amount of research that talks about how treatment, service, supervision, and sanctions can work together. And what that means is there's a balanced approach to how we move forward with the population. If somebody comes to us and they're not motivated to change, they're not in the space to do it, they're pretty comfortable in what they're doing right now. It's just, the sanction is getting in the way, the system is getting in the way a little bit. Then when they come to us, we impose an external motivation. We say, if you don't do this, here's the consequence. It may not be jail. It might be we're going to send you out on the work crew or some of those things.
Or write a letter.
Write a letter.
The consequence for each individual is individualized, so it is a consequence. 5 days to someone who's been in jail in and out for 20 years isn't a consequence.
Yeah.
Public speaking, consequence.
Yeah.
you know.
I concur with that. Yeah.
Well, and that's great. That's a great point. You do an individualized plan on what works for each individual person. But if we can impose this external motivation, if you will, like if you don't do it, there's a consequence, and we get them into services, the longer that they're in those services, they become able to become internally motivated or intrinsically motivated.
Mm-hmm.
And as that happens, they're going to have some speed bumps along
Sure.
the way. But that's the goal of the system. Like,
Yeah.
get them in a space that maybe they don't want to do on their own. If we can get them there and we can keep them there, then it's no longer about a consequence. Now it's about what's an incentive for you moving forward.
Sure.
And so we really need to look at the system as a whole that way. We've spent a lot of time this morning talking about, the jail and imposing consequences for behaviors. Not everybody needs that,
Sure.
but a large population needs that.
Yeah.
But we also we know in our world, 33% of a person's ability to succeed under community supervision is based on their relationship with their parole and probation officer.
Yeah.
Building rapport, creating an opportunity for that person to come in and say, I messed up, and know that we're not immediately going to maybe place them in custody for that. And that's a relationship that the judge did a great job talking about, that they get in treatment court, right? The judges begin to have a relationship, and the person on supervision sees that the judge isn't just there in the black robe and a gavel to lock them up. It's really about building that connection moving forward. And we have a lot of successes. We have probably more successes than we give ourselves credit for. I think
Sure.
our positive closure rate for our community, the numbers just came out, and we're right around 74%. So that's
great.
pretty
That's
impactful.
great.
Now, positive case closure doesn't mean they're not recidivating. It doesn't mean at some point they didn't commit
Sure.
a new crime.
Yeah.
But we got them to a level that they're doing pretty well, and they don't really need us in their lives anymore.
Yeah.
And that's really the goal. We have a small criminal population in our community, really, if we look at the overall numbers.
Sure.
But we have a lot of opportunity for intervention and change, and I think systemically working together, we get the value of seeing that. One of the things we've done on our website, we have a link where people can go to, and we have, I think, 6 or 7 people that have gone through the system and talked about their own experiences and the success of that system. And I think when you talk to some of our peers that have been involved and now are coming back to give back to the population, they talk about, it wasn't very great at the beginning, but eventually I got there, and now I have an opportunity to give back to this community, and that's how they look at that.
And something else that they talk about, and I'd be remiss to not mention it, is the impact that the deputies in the jail have on the inmates.
Right.
Yeah.
And so often someone will be in my court and say, Deputy so-and-so just gave me a number. Like,
Yeah.
took the time to give me a number for, one of the treatment providers
Sure.
or talk to them. And
Yeah.
it's really, because they were treated with kindness, they were treated with humanity, as they should
Yeah.
be.
Oh, yeah.
And not just, a number. And everyone's doing their part, I guess, is
Yeah, what that comes down to is, time and space
Yep.
for us, right? Like when you have such a busy facility where you have, this year almost 12,000 people coming through your facility, and you have to release people every day. Sometimes we can catch people and we can get them engaged with our, JRRP folks, and to where then they can get some, assistance with the social determinants and some other things. And that's really good, but we also miss a lot of people because of just how the system operates, and being able to slow down things makes time for those proactive contacts, those relationships. And it's a pretty, I think, universally known that like if we can spend some time with people on the streets, like when we're in our patrol duties and listening to what their problem is and trying to help them, it goes a long way versus just show up and say, give me the numbers, I got to go, right? Like there's a much different feel to
I think that
how you're-
transcends just into how we live our lives.
exactly.
Like, people generally need to slow down and check in on people
Yeah.
and take the time to make sure people be seen
Yeah.
and heard.
Yeah.
And
And when
It's
your
important.
system runs at red line,
it's,
those things are more challenging.
yeah.
And I think the whole premise is like, what is the weak link of that system, and then how do we identify, how do we fix it and move forward, slow everything else down, and then really see the benefits of that long term.
Yeah. You have to be able to see long term.
You know, Sheriff, I think that we've talked about it a little bit, but I think it's important to, like, as far as the jail, we really need to emphasize that our jail release resource program, because that has built a foundation for those folks that do end up going into custody, getting services that they need. It's not just you go into custody, you have nothing to do all day except for, you know, tell stories about your criminality or any of those things. We're actually now in a position, because of the incredible relationships we have, where we're able to address some of those things that are contributing to that criminality while they're in custody. And probably the most significant piece of that is when somebody leaves jail, whether they've been there 2 days, 10 days, 30 days, we now are nearly there where we will have somebody ready to meet them as they leave. Because most people that are releasing, if somebody's not there for them, they're going right back to what they came from.
Yep.
But when we have peers available that can be there upon release, they've made that connection while they're in custody, they are there when they leave, and then they continue to be with them, we're going to see a much higher rate of success. And we've invested systemically in this program. We have lots of funding
Is that
sources.
partially Pathfinders?
Our
'Cause I
peer,
know they were located in your.
yeah, the opioid use dollars, or the opioid settlement dollars, are paying for the sheriff's office to have 3 peer groups in place. So it's the Pathfinders, On Track, and
I
Recovery
call
Cafe.
Pathfinders. I think I have 3 guys, and I say guys because they're guys, they're not gals, on my cell phone. And I'll be like, hey, so-and-so's getting released. I just sentenced them.
Yeah.
Will you go meet them?
Yeah.
And I can see them outside my window from my chambers, and they'll be waiting there. And they greet them, and it's like a handoff. And it's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah. No, we've seen some great success, and we talked a little bit about that when we did our jail part 1 tour of this and some of the programs, and Josh was going through those, and they're great. And you know, the ultimate goal, as we always say, is we want to reduce the number of people that are involved in our criminal justice system. Like, and then if they do get involved, how do we prevent them from reoffending and continuing to use the resources?
Well, and I think a lot of times, too, as we talk about jail, just in general, again, there's this idea that there's nothing happening. And for a while, maybe there wasn't. But there are things happening now. And because we're building that foundation in the jail now, we're really starting to realize that because folks aren't staying long enough for us to have those interactions while people are in custody, we have a large population that we're missing.
Yeah.
Right? And so having the capacity to continue to build on what is in the jail now is going to be incredible. And so not just the services itself, but the capacity to keep people long enough to where that interruption of criminality is not just time and space, but also services delivered while in custody and then continuing as they release. So I think, there's a lot of wonderful things that are in place right now, and we still have a few more challenges.
Yeah, I know Deschutes County, I look at them because they typically have a fairly low population compared to us as far as daily usage of their jail. So they're never full, right? And they never force release. And they release at prescribed times each day. So when people are set to get out, they get out at I don't remember the exact times, but they can really put their resources around those release times and make sure people are met as they're leaving. So, the whole system just functions much more efficiently when you do that. And then the long-term effects are reduced costs. And, you spend money to save money, or you have a bigger jail that's not full versus a small jail that's always full. And it's like, I think it's better to have the empty building, right? I mean, honestly, that's a sign of a healthier community in my mind, is when you don't have to use your jail. To its fullest capacity, right? You always need some, but when you're not always full, that's a good thing. So,
and I think weaving in really that there are a lot of opportunities for people that go into custody when they release.
There's
and
definitely
more and more every day.
Yeah,
especially with methadone being available, and so when people are releasing, they're on medication so that we don't see some of those overdoses we were seeing for people that were immediately released.
Yeah, no, those are, I'm looking forward to seeing the results of those programs as time goes on, because they're fairly new, but I think they're going to be very impactful.
Well, we started in May, and
Yeah.
at that point it was, where are we going to put the desk? So from
Yeah.
where are we going to put the desk to, I think we have a researcher that we're paying for attached to this program to help us identify gaps in where we can do things better. I think that we're just going to continue to see access to service more available for those people that are staying long enough for us to get the service to them.
That'd be great. All right. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, so I want to thank you for being here, and thanks for sharing your professional insights and opinions and your experiences. It's been great. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us.